Out here, rain doesn't just fall, it listens. In the deep quiet of the Pacific Northwest, fog swallows sound whole, ancient trees hold secrets in their rings, and the water speaks, especially when no one should be talking. Tonight we're prying open the silence with 6 true accounts that defy explanation. These aren't just stories. They're logged calls, chilling photographs, and scars on people who now keep their boots by the bed just in case. We'll investigate a signal that rings from the deep, a voice on a dead phone line, and a house that inches toward something hungry in the woods. You'll hear about a tune that moves your lips without your permission, a crossing that refuses to arrive, and a hallway of empty air that feels like it's breathing you in. So turn the lights down and lock your door. And if you hear 3 knocks, or a long, patient 4th, do not answer. Listen with us. Subscribe and hit that bell, because you won't want to miss a second of this. The first call came at 2:14 in the morning, on a phone that wasn't supposed to ring. I was alone, isolated in a glass box perched on a narrow spine of rock. Below me, a black forest fell away into darkness in every direction. The only sounds were the soft ticking of the cooling stove and the hum of the guy wires as the wind pushed against them. The map table sat quiet, a grid of potential disasters, waiting for smoke I hoped would never appear. The phone was an old magneto set mounted by the door, a forgotten relic. The porcelain insulators on the wall still held a deadline, cut years ago, the wire hanging in a neat coil like a sleeping snake. I'd looked at it 100 times, always thinking of it as just a piece of history, a decoration. So when it rang, the sound was thin and tired, like an echo from another century. 2 long rings, then 1 short. The bell trembled, as if it was reluctant to even make a sound. My body reacted before my mind could process the impossibility of it all. I lifted the earpiece. That's just what you do when a phone rings, no matter how wrong the situation feels. The mouthpiece smelled of dust and cold metal. The voice that met me was thin, distant, and eerily plain. It said, "Look out to lookout. Do you have eyes on the north slope?" There was wind behind the words, but it wasn't the wind I could hear outside my tower. This wind had a strange whine to it, like wires singing under tension. I stared at the dead coil on the wall, then glanced out the window to my north. All I could see was a ridge silhouetted against the stars and a river valley holding a darker kind of black. There was no fire, no glow, no column of smoke ghosting the pale moon. "Which tower is this?" I asked, my own voice sounding strange in the quiet room. The voice on the other end paused, taking a breath that sounded like it hurt. "South Rim," it said. Then it added, "Kettle Ridge." It used both names, as if it couldn't decide which was right. I let my finger slide across the worn surface of the map to where Kettle Ridge used to be. The tiny square marking the old South Rim Tower was still there, but only because the map was as old as the phone. A small X was printed next to the name. Decommissioned. It was torn down in a storm, or maybe it burned down. The story changed depending on which old-timer you asked over coffee in town. It wasn't there anymore. I felt the solid floor under my boots, then became acutely aware of the vast emptiness just beneath that floor. I reminded myself that people love pranks, even elaborate ones. "Your line is dead," I said, trying to sound firm, dismissive. The voice replied, "Please confirm if the river is moving." What a strange question. I opened the door and stepped out onto the catwalk. The night air pressed in, soft and heavy and damp. I rested my hand on one of the guy wires. It thrummed with the wind's energy. Far below, the trees made that immense, slow sound a forest makes when it breathes. The river was just a darker thread woven into the fabric of the night, impossible to see clearly. As I scanned the horizon for any sign of smoke, I caught a strange scent on the wind. It was sweet and sharp, like sap heating on hot metal. I pulled my head back inside and reached for my proper equipment, the radio. Static. The channel was dead silent. Dispatch was either asleep or had stepped away. I wasn't about to wake up another lookout for what was probably just a weird prank call from a ghost phone. But before I could even set the radio down, the bell rang again. The same pattern. 2 long, 1 short. I put the receiver back to my ear. "It is at the stairs now," the voice said. The words were flat, emotionless, as if he were simply reading a measurement from a dial. "Do you have any smoke above your roof?" I instinctively looked up, as if the glass ceiling could somehow show me something I desperately didn't want to see. The single bulb hanging over the map table cast a tired circle of light, and moths fluttered against it like dull, desperate coins. "Who are you?" I demanded. "I can see your lamp," the voice said. A cold dread washed over me. I turned in a slow, deliberate circle, my eyes scanning the 360 degrees of blackness surrounding my glass box. I saw nothing. Nothing but my own reflection, faint in every pane of glass. In that doubled, ghostly image, my face looked older, worn down like it had been awake for years. Then I heard it, a soft tap on wood coming from below me. It was nothing, I told myself, just the tower settling as it cools, the same way the stove pops and ticks. But the taps came again, gentle and careful, like someone testing the wood, knuckles rapping on the underside of the trapdoor that led up into my lookout. The cadence was chillingly familiar. 2 long taps, 1 short. Silence suddenly felt more terrifying than the strange voice. I pressed the earpiece back to my head. The sound on the line had changed. It was closer now. I could hear breathing, slow and wet, right next to the microphone. "Please keep talking," the voice said, almost politely. "If I let it get quiet, it comes closer." I didn't want to know what it was. I dodged the question, asking one of my own. "What is your name?" The line seemed to stretch out, pulled taut with unspoken tension. "I had one," he finally said. "It is on a tag. I can't read it now." My gaze drifted to the old metal tag hooked to my tower's doorframe. It was stamped with the structure's number and the date of its last repair. I'd traced the dents in it with my finger more than once during long, lonely days when bad weather pinned me inside. The thought that he was talking about a similar tag, hanging near him in whatever cold, dark place he was in, made my skin crawl. "Tell me what you see," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He described a chilling scene. Glass. Smoke pressed flat to it. Stairs. And someone under them with his face turned up, like a fish looking up from the bottom of a pond. As he spoke, I heard a sound from the wall, a small, dry hiss. The coiled snake of dead wire had shifted. I stared at it, feeling stupid for being so fixated on an inanimate object. The bell on the phone mount trembled again, but this time, the sound didn't come from the bell. It vibrated through the posts, up from the floor, through the very bones of the tower itself. The radio on the table clicked once on its own and then went silent. The tapping under the trapdoor returned, a soft, hesitant pattern, like someone working up the courage to knock again, but louder this time. I couldn't hold the phone anymore. I set the earpiece down on the map table. The voice didn't stop. It continued talking, thin and tinny, as if it were addressing the empty room now. "Do you see it yet?" it asked. "Do you see yourself?" My eyes were drawn back to the glass. I saw my reflection, pale and scared. And then I saw something else. A second shape, standing just behind my shoulder, where the dark shadow of the stove should have been. It stood perfectly, unnaturally still. At that exact moment, the phone began to ring again, its shrill, archaic sound filling the small space. and in perfect, horrifying synchronicity, with the exact same rhythm, something knocked, hard, from under the trapdoor. The bell on the phone screamed, and the wood under my feet answered. 2 long knocks, 1 short. I picked up the phone. "I hear you," I said. A voice soft and papery like old leaves whispered, "Don't let it finish the knock." "How?" I asked, my own voice tight. He said, "Fill the quiet." So I talked. I did the thing they tell you in training when panic walks in and sits down. I read the weather log out loud. I listed the bearings of ridges I could only see in daylight. I named creeks I knew just by their smell. While I spoke, the taps from below stayed thin, hesitant. But when I paused to breathe, the knock came back harder like a fist punching up through the pine floorboards. The whole trapdoor lifted a hair and then dropped. "Is your river moving?" The man on the phone asked again. "Please check." I stepped out onto the catwalk and looked down where I knew the bend lay. The night was a solid sheet of black. No moon, just a pale, useless leak of light in the east. I couldn't see the river, but I could feel the lack of it like a missing tooth. There should have been a sound, a constant rush, but there was nothing. The wind hissed against the guy wires, and then even that quieted, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I went back inside. My mouth was dry enough to crack. "It feels still," I said. "It feels like a picture." The man on the line breathed out with a small click, like cellophane crinkling. "That is when it climbs," he said. He whispered the next word so softly I had to press the earpiece hard against my ear to hear them. "Don't open the hatch." Just then, the trapdoor bumped my boot. It was almost polite, as if a hand had tapped me, wanting my attention. I slid the deadbolt into the hatch latch anyway. The steel clink sounded thin and useless in the silence. A smear shaped like a forehead appeared in the dust on the wood, right where my knee had been just moments before. It was damp. It got darker as I watched, as if the wood itself was sweating. The knocks changed. They went from sounding like bone to sounding like meat. A solid palm now, feeling out the shape of the door. The radio cracked open with a static that tasted like metal. A voice came through. It was my own voice, my own cadence, but it was playing back words I had said an hour before, like a recording played all wrong. "Which tower is this?" it asked. Then a second version of me, closer this time, said, "Your line is dead." I clicked the transmit button and I heard my own click echo back from the floor, half a second later. I grabbed a lantern off its hook and turned the knob. The mantle bloomed to life and the room was washed in a deeper color. In the window's reflection I saw my face, and behind it, right where the stove's shadow should have been, a pale oval was looking over my shoulder. It wasn't a face that anyone had ever made. It was just the idea of one, cold and simple and waiting. When I spun around, there was nothing there but the dark square shape of the stove. "Tell me your tag," I said into the phone. "Read the numbers." He tried. His breath stalled like it had to get around some heavy weight. "I can't see it," he said. "There is smoke on the glass." He was quiet for a heartbeat, and then he said something that sank into me like a hook. "I am in your tower." The hatch knocked again, impatient now. The bolt actually moved a hair in the latch. "Tell me something only you would know," I said, desperate for any proof that this was just some elaborate, cruel trick. He said, "Your ankle clicks going down, 3rd step from the top. You count in your head to 6 when you turn the weather key. You keep your photo under the map." My hand trembled as I lifted the corner of the map. The photo of my wife and me at the trailhead lay there just as he said, and the edge of it was wet. I talked and talked after that. I read the entire maintenance list. I read the labels on the fuses in the breaker box. I named every single bird I had heard that week. When I started to run out of words, I found myself telling stories I hadn't thought about in years. I told the empty room about my father's last fire and the way he held a smoke between two fingers, even when his hands shook so badly. The knocking slowed when I spoke about him, but it always came back if I stopped. It got very, very fast when the first pale wash of dawn finally showed in the east. The voice on the phone said, sure of itself now, "Do not look down." Of course I looked. The thin crack along the edge of the hatch showed dark, like it was filled with water. A pale shape was pressed up against it from below, featureless as the belly of a fish. Patient. My name tag pinned to the doorframe ticked in the cooling air. The metal made a tiny ringing sound. 2 long, 1 short. Then the sun finally touched the far ridge. The wind woke up like a startled animal. The guy wires sang their song. And somewhere deep in the timber, the river made its sound again, low and full. The knocks under my feet softened, then withdrew, like hands sliding off a ladder, one rung at a time. The voice on the phone said, so close it felt like his mouth was on my ear, "Thank you." And then the line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for the rest of my hitch up there. When the relief ranger came up with coffee and a new pack of mantles, I didn't show him anything. I signed the log. I put my hand on the hatch and felt nothing come back. When I climbed down for the last time, I checked the underside of the deck. I felt ashamed, like a man checking a mirror for something he knows is there. The beams had fresh smears at even intervals, the width of a palm, dark with sap and something else. And there on the landing, a small brass tag lay where no tag should be. It was stamped with the name of my tower, South Rim, but the date on it was the morning I was leaving. I live in town now. I teach kids how to read a map and not to panic if they get turned around in the woods. Most nights the river makes its dull, easy sound through my window and I sleep just fine. But every few weeks at exactly 2:14 in the morning, my phone lights up with a call from a number that has too many zeros. When I lift it, there's only my own breath on the line, and under it the thin sound of a wire singing in the wind. And somewhere inside the house the wood answers, 2 long, 1 short. And I start talking, just so it doesn't get the chance to finish. You know how people say a house settles? My house doesn't settle. It moves. It slides when it rains, like it's trying to get somewhere I can't see. I rented it because it was cheap and just 10 minutes from town. It sat on this steep wedge of land above a creek, all cedar shingle skin, a small deck, and a yard just choked with sword ferns and blackberries. The landlord, he called the hill a view. He called the definite tilt of the floor seasonal settling. He said it with this casual shrug, like the house just sighed a little in the winter and that was all there was to it. I'd moved up here for quiet, for a fresh start, so I told myself, you know, I can live with a little tilt. I learned in that very first week that the tilt has moods. When the weather was dry, the floor felt normal enough you wouldn't notice. But in a light drizzle, a marble would just roll to the corner by the back door and nestle there like it had picked a bed for the night. In a hard rain, I could feel the whole couch shift. Just a hair. The coffee in my mug would lean to one side. The pictures on the wall, they tried their best to hang straight, but they always failed. I went under the house once. The plumber had to come out to fix a soft spot in the bathroom floor, the crawl space. It smelled like wet pennies and old creosote. And the foundation wasn't a slab. It was post and pier, these short stacks of cinder blocks resting on old timbers laid out like railroad tracks, all slick and black with moisture. I asked the plumber about them and he just spit out some rainwater and said, "Skid Road. They used to grease these with fish oil and tallow to drag logs downhill. Somebody built right on top of it." He wiped his hands on his pants and added, like a joke that wasn't a joke, Don't be here in a downpour." I thought he meant floods. The creek down the slope ran muddy and brown when it stormed, always throwing sticks around like a hyperactive kid. My neighbor, a widow with a little dog, she waved at me one day from her yard. She called over, "Keep your bed on the uphill side in winter." I just laughed. But she didn't laugh back. She said, "Don't sleep on the creek side when it pours. I don't want to have to call for you after." Then she reached out and squeezed my forearm, with this grip that said she wasn't telling some spooky local story. The first real storm came with that long, sighing sound the forest makes when every tree is drinking at once. It started at dusk and just thickened by midnight. The creek's bubbling voice was completely lost under the hiss of the rain. The air smelled like cedar and mud and something metallic like rust. I was lying in bed with that sound pressing down on the roof, and I felt it. The house took a slow step. It wasn't a jolt or a shudder. It was a slide, like a heavy dresser being moved carefully across a wood floor, slow and sure. The headboard of my bed touched the wall with a hollow little knock. I reached my hand out and touched the wall, and it felt damp, as if the rain had somehow come inside and just stood there for a while. I got up and started walking from room to room. The hallway felt a little longer than it had before. The kitchen floor had a new, more pronounced tilt. 3 of the cabinet doors had crept open on their own and were just hanging there like open mouths. The back door had stuck at the latch. When I finally forced it open, this wave of cold air poured through, and the smell of mud hit me so hard it made my eyes water. I looked down. The deck had a new, inch-wide gap where it met the threshold. I could see pure darkness through it, like a seam opening up to a place under the house that hadn't been there before. I grabbed a level from my toolbox and put it on the dining table. The bubble shot to one end and just held there, steady. I snapped a chalk line on the drywall near the floor. Then I did it again the next morning, and again after that. They made this small, terrifying ladder of proof. With each storm, the line stepped down. The house was going somewhere, steady and slow like old water leaving a lake. When the second big storm came, the power started to hiccup. My phone buzzed with weather warnings and then just choked out. The radio kept saying this phrase, "atmospheric river." The dog next door started crying, this mean, sharp little sound that for some reason made me feel human again. I sat in the living room with a headlamp around my neck, and I just waited for the shift. When it came, it carried the refrigerator a 1/4 of an inch. It carried me a breath. The front steps made a new noise, a sound of wood grinding on wood, crossed with the sound of a wet rope being pulled tight over a log. And then the whole place went quiet after, like the house was listening to see if I'd noticed. I started keeping notes. I had to. I didn't want to think it was all in my head. I wrote down how many seconds the rain was heavy. I wrote down how long the creaking lasted before each slide, how many degrees the plumb bob turned when I set it dangling from the kitchen light fixture. Then I found it. A small cardboard box in the back of the hall closet, with the previous tenant's things. The box held a bundle of papers tied with old string and a little pencil stub. On the top sheet, someone had written in these neat, slow letters, "It wants the gully." And under that, a row of dates and words. 1/2 inch. Bed uphill. Don't block the drain. And there was a little map of the yard, a line drawn from the back door to a black circle in the ferns. The circle was labeled simply, "Pit." I went out between showers to see if the pit was real. The ferns behind the house were taller than I am, and they crowded right up against the siding when they were wet. I pushed through them and found it, a sag in the ground where the ferns grew thicker and the soil had no other plants, just slick, wet clay with a skin of water on it. When I tapped it with my boot, it made a little ringing sound, like something was hollow underneath. I stepped back so fast. Every hair along my arms had lifted, like the weather itself had just walked up to me and said my name. That night the rain came in hard bursts, and the house answered each one with a patient, rhythmic slide. Sometime after midnight, a long, low sound started to climb out of the floorboards, like a breath being drawn through a cracked reed. The living room shifted so slowly I could actually see the walls moving against the picture frames. The front door rattled in its jamb. I went to try it, and the latch clicked, but the door wouldn't swing open. I leaned into it with my shoulder and it gave, and I had one single, crystal-clear second to understand that the porch was no longer there. The door opened onto nothing but dark air and the sound of wet rope moving over wood. And the whole house took another sure, careful step into the night. I remember grabbing the door frame, leaning out just enough to see a black square where my porch should have been. The rain was coming down in these tight silver lines, and underneath it all there was this sound, like a wet rope being dragged over wood. I felt the house shift, just a slow inch, and the plates in the cupboard whispered together, a sound like chattering teeth. I tried to push the door shut, but it bumped back at me. The frame wasn't square anymore. The whole floor had a new slant. My coffee mug, sitting on the counter, just slid half an inch on its own, then stopped as if an invisible hand had caught it. I said my neighbor's name, almost like a prayer, and I heard her call back, her voice thin through the rain. "Up here, come uphill." Her dog yipped twice, then just stopped, like a door had closed inside its throat. I ran to the bedroom window on the uphill side of the house. The frame was swollen tight from the rain, but it finally gave way with a long, sticky sigh. On dry days, I could see the road from here, and my neighbor's split-rail fence. But tonight, the window just looked into a solid wall of wet soil. The ground had pushed itself right up against the siding like a shoulder. I put my palm to the glass, and I swear, something on the other side pressed back. It wasn't hard, just this steady, constant pressure, the same way the house was moving. My mind raced to the crawl space. The access hatch was in the hall closet, just a rough square cut into the floor, paint flaking off it like dandruff. I suddenly remembered the plumber's voice from last year, and the strange smell of fish oil he'd mentioned down there. I told myself I needed to do something, anything. Wedge some timbers, chalk the foundation. If I could just jam the skids, maybe the house would stop wanting to go downhill. I called 911 and got a polite, robotic voice. "All circuits are busy." And then the line just filled with the sound of rain. While that recording was still playing, the next slide came. The floor moved under my feet like the house was taking a breath, and it made this long, low sound. Wood speaking to mud. The lights dipped, then came back on, but they had this jaundiced, sickly yellow glow. I pulled open the hatch to the crawl space. A warm, wet smell climbed up and wrapped around my head. I shone my flashlight down, and the beam found the beams, but they weren't beams. They were old logs laid end to end, slick with this black grease that shone like something alive. The grease was beaded up in places like sweat. I could see track marks running along the tops of the logs, worn in from something narrow pulling itself hand over hand for years and years. The tracks led out to the fern pit in the yard, which now looked like a dark, open mouth. And below those skids, there was a blackness that breathed. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a pull you could almost lean into. Then my neighbor's voice cut through the noise again. "The bathroom window! I'm throwing a line!" A rope slapped against the siding, then the window trim, and it wiggled its way into my hands like a live thing. It was new rope, stiff and clean. I looped it around my waist and tied it twice, just the way my father had taught me, even though I hadn't used those knots in years. The house moved again, another patient inch, and the knot bit hard into my ribs. "Come now," she yelled. Her voice wasn't loud, just, "Sure." I put my shoulder to the old window sash and jammed my hammer handle under it. The glass shook. The frame gave a little and then a lot. Wet wood tearing apart like bread. The window became a rectangle of mud just inches away from my face. It was climbing while I watched, as if the hill itself was trying to block my escape. The rope jerked hard. My neighbor had taken up the slack and set her feet. I could hear her shoes scuffing on her porch boards. "I've got you," she said, but her voice went softer at the end, and that scared me more than anything else. I crawled into the bathroom and pushed at the smaller window there. It stuck, then popped open. Cold mud immediately pushed a little tongue under the sill, leaving a slick on the tile. I shoved the trash can under the frame to wedge it open. The house leaned harder. I heard a drawer slide open somewhere and just stay open. The fridge hummed, then walked itself a slow inch and tapped against the wall, like it was looking for a secret entrance. I got my shoulders through the window and felt the hill press against my ribs. The rope burned a line under my arms. The house took another measured step, and the rope sang as it slid through my neighbor's gloved hands. It was the same sound from under the floor. Wet rope over wood. Pull, set, pull. Then I heard a knock from the crawl space. A dull thud that didn't belong to plumbing. It knocked again, closer to the foundation this time, like a fist learning the language of my house. The smell of grease rolled up and filled my mouth, tasting like old fish and pennies and tallow candles. The knot at my waist loosened just a hair as the rope turned slick in my hands. I looked down, and my palms were black with it. This wasn't from her rope. It was coming out of me, out of the wood, out of the years trapped under the house. I took a breath and pushed with everything I had left. The hill allowed me an inch. My neighbor made a sound I'd never heard from a human throat before, and she ladled me upwards with that sound. My hips cleared the sash. We slid together over the water-heavy ferns, edging uphill, dragging the rope between us. And then we were on her porch planks, which felt like the solid deck of a boat after you be just jumped out of a river. We just sat there and watched my house move. There was nothing else to do. It didn't tumble or lurch. It was considerate. It seemed to consider the slope, then take its space, sure of itself, like an old logger reading the land. It turned itself, lining up those black skids with the slick trail in the ferns. The pit in the yard had opened wider, its rim crumbling, showing old cedar slats inside that had never seen daylight, shining in the gloom. The house eased toward it until the front steps just kissed the edge. Then the rain thinned, and that rope sound slowed and finally went still, as if someone had finally set a heavy thing down right where it wanted to be. In the gray morning light, the trail the house had made looked like a tongue licking down to the mouth in the ferns. The porch lay on its side halfway down, its ribs pointing up. The neighbor and I stood with coffee and just watched the steam rise from the pit, like breath. In the mud by her fence, I saw my box of notes. And there was a new page on top, clean and wet. It was my paper, but the pencil strokes were not mine. They read in slow, careful letters, "It wants weight." I moved out that day with only what I could carry. The county came with their tape and their forms. They used words like slow slide and groundwater and old timber underpinnings. Words that were a way to believe it all just lived in the dirt. I sleep 2 towns over now, on flat ground, with a cinder block wall to my back and a parking lot light that hums all night. But when it rains hard, I feel it. The bed shifts a hair toward the window. There's a sound in the wall, soft and patient and familiar. If I put my palm on the floor, something on the other side presses back, not hard, just steady. The hotel carpet under the bed is damp in a single stripe. And this morning there was a little smear on the leg of the bed frame, black and greasy. The chalk line I drew on the baseboard last night has already stepped down. People always laugh when I tell them I used to whistle back at the birds. It seems innocent enough, right? A simple, harmless habit. But you do that in a cedar forest long enough, and eventually, the forest starts to answer back with something that isn't a bird. It all started when I was helping a friend survey a cedar bog way out past the river. This place, it was ancient. The trees were massive, so big they made you feel insignificant, and the air had this strange taste, like old pennies and cold tea. Our base was a tiny research shed perched on cedar blocks, with just a cot, a stove that smoked more than it heated, and a narrow boardwalk that was our only path above the murky brown water. My friend usually headed back to town at night, but I'd stay for a week at a time. I loved the solitude, the quiet, the sound of rain on the roof, and the rich smell of wet wood. On still evenings, I'd take a walk along the boardwalk and whistle a simple 3-note tune from my childhood. It was a small comfort, a way to feel less alone in that vast, silent place. The first time it happened, it was late afternoon. The light under the thick canopy had turned this eerie, deep green. Without even thinking, I whistled my little tune. 3 clean notes. And then, an answer. It came back with the exact same timing, the same 3 notes, but the sound was thinner, like it was being pushed through a straw. My first thought was a varied thrush. If you're from around here, you know their song. Long, pure notes that can make the hairs on your neck stand up. But this wasn't that. This was my whistle, my tune, just carried back to me with no bird in between. I looked around. The cedars stood in tight, silent ranks, their trunks dark and ribbed. I noticed the old springboard cuts in their sides, scars left by loggers decades ago. They're these deep, rectangular gashes where they'd set boards to stand on while they cut the tree down. If you don't know what they are, they look unnervingly like mouths chewed into the wood. The boardwalk creaked under my feet, a wet, protesting sound. I whistled again, a little faster this time. The answer came back instantly, mimicking my new pace. A little faster. I stopped. The forest was silent for a moment. And then, it whistled once more by itself. It sounded impatient. It came from a spot to my left where there was nothing but black water and a thick carpet of fallen needles. I scanned the planks of the boardwalk. No footprints but my own. There was nowhere for anyone to stand out there without sinking to their knees in mud. I tried to rationalize it. Wind can do strange things in dense timber, I told myself. But the air was completely still. The scent of cedar was heavy, almost cloyingly sweet, with that sharp, cat-like tang it gets when it's wet. I could see little shreds of bark hanging off those springboard cuts like strands of hair. I thought I saw movement in the shadows between the trees, a dark shape swaying, and I flinched, then laughed at myself. It was just a tangle of old roots, rocking in a slow, deep breath the forest seemed to take. Back at the shed, I made my entry in the research log like I was supposed to. Weather calm, no wind. Then, as a dark joke to keep myself from writing person, I added, Whistler and stand north of Transect 2. The stove popped, making me jump. A single drip from the eave hit the same spot on the board outside, over and over, a steady, maddening metronome. As full darkness fell, I heard the last calls of the thrushes as they settled down for the night. And then, it started again. From right beside the shed, just inches from the wall, came my tune, thin and persistent like it was trying to push its way through the wood. I quickly turned off my lamp. I didn't want to risk catching my own reflection in the dark window pane. The rain began, a light patter at first. Each drop seemed to be held and released by the giant cedars one at a time, patient as a leaky faucet. The whistling began to move. It circled the shed. When I walked, it matched my pace. When I paused, it paused. When I held my breath, it held its breath. I grabbed my radio and keyed the mic. The only sound that came back was the static hiss of the rain, but underneath it, faint but clear, were my 3 notes. It was quiet, as if the radio was picking up the sound from just outside the wall. That was it. I had to know. I pulled on my rain shell, grabbed my headlamp, and opened the door. The beam of light hit the foggy breath of the night and was swallowed up, creating only a short, bright tunnel in the darkness. The boardwalk shone like a wet snake. The whistling was everywhere now. First it played from the springboard cuts about 50 feet away, then from somewhere low, near the water's surface. Then, impossibly, from high up in the canopy where nothing stood but empty branches. It was trying on different places, different voices, like a child trying on shoes. It wasn't moving from one spot to the next in a straight line. It was testing which mouth fit it best. "Don't be a fool," I whispered to myself, but I stepped out onto the boardwalk anyway. The planks were treacherous, slick with algae and old cedar oil. My boots slipped, searching for a grip. I made my way to a big stump with 2 deep notches cut into it, one that always looked like a strange wooden chair by the bend in the path. Those notches had always looked like eyes to me. Tonight, when the whistle came, it sounded like it was coming from inside those 2 square holes. I leaned in close. I could smell the damp, decaying wood and a sour metallic note, like a saw blade that had been heated years ago and never cooled. Down in the stump's dark, water-filled hollow, something pale shifted, and then went still. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. I figured if it was a person, I didn't want them to think I meant any harm. The word came back to me, but it wasn't an echo. It was flat. Dead. It was a piece of my own voice, just used again. A drop of water hit the back of my neck inside my hood. It was warm. And wrong. The whistle changed. It slid up into a high, questioning note I had never used. It hung there in the air, waiting. I swallowed hard and, feeling a strange compulsion, I whistled back the answer I thought it wanted. It seemed pleased. It gave me my 3 notes back, and then it added a 4th, a note I didn't know. And on that 4th note, a long strip of bark on the nearest tree trunk slowly lifted, revealing a wet, pale layer underneath. It looked like skin. I stumbled backward, my heels skating on the slime. The beam of my headlamp jumped wildly, and in that frantic flash of light, I saw it in my peripheral vision. A figure. It was standing in the deepest part of the water, where there was no footing. It was the same height as me, the same general shape as me, but it was not. It didn't move like a person moves. It tilted like something hung from a rope, swaying in a wind that wasn't there. And then the whistle came from inside my hood, not from outside. It was so close I could feel the puff of air on the tiny hairs at the back of my ear. Something dry and scratchy like cedar fingers brushed against my cheek. And that 4th note, the new one, formed in my throat, vibrating in my mouth, without my lips moving at all. The 4th note held in my mouth like a coin, cool and wrong without my lips moving at all. My tongue went numb at the edges. My breath shaped the sound by itself, a long, thin thread that made the cedar bark around me lift and settle like skin taking a breath. I snapped my mouth shut and the note kept going through my teeth for a heartbeat, like a draft through a crack. The thing that had brushed my cheek withdrew slow, as if I had disappointed it. The board under my boots hummed, a sound too low to be heard, more than felt. From the nearest springboard cut, my 3 notes came back at once, perfect. Then the 4th, full of my air but not my will. I said my name aloud to break it. My voice came out small and went into the cedars and came back as a thin copy that wasn't quite my voice. The copy tried to hide something under it. The fourth note again, a little longer, like a finger pushed against my teeth from the inside. I backed onto the planks, and every drip from the canopy seemed to time itself to that note. The beam of my headlamp slid over a place on the trunk where the bark had loosened and hung like a flap. Under it, the wood was pale, almost white, wet like a mouth. The whistle moved there. I watched it. I mean that. I watched a sound move. It bulged the pale layer as if breath were being pushed out through the wood. "Enough," I said, and I hated that my voice shook. I tried to hum something ugly and flat to foul it. The whistle tried to climb over the hum and failed for a second, like a hand reaching for a ledge and missing. Then it learned my ugly tune and used it too better than I could. I turned and walked, careful on the slime, back toward the shed. The whistle paced me in the cuts to my left until there were no cuts, and then it stepped into the wall of the shed without a sound. The little place was just cedar boards and old nails. The door creaked in a way I'd always liked. My chest felt tight with the desire to make any sound that wasn't that note, but I didn't dare. The stove ticked. The roof rang very softly with the big drops the cedars save and let go. I sat on the cot and clamped my jaw with both hands like a child with a loose tooth. The whistle came anyway, through the walls. Not loud, just close. It did not care that there was a roof between us. Roofs in that place are made of the same thing as trunks. In the corner, the logbook lay open to my handwriting. The page lifted in the small breaths the room was making as if the shed had a chest. I tried the radio as a test. "Base, do you copy?" I said. The return was a smear of rain, and under it, the whistle slid out of the speaker, the exact length of the wire between us, as if the radio's little innards were a throat. I thumbed it off and the whistle went on without it. I tore a strip off an old shirt and tied it over my mouth and nose. It helped as much as a wish. The fourth note rose in my head instead, a pressure in the sinuses, in the small bones around my ears. Every so often, the shape in the trees tried a fifth, low and rough, and let it go like it hurt. When it did, the cutouts in the old stump seemed to widen and narrow together. A slow blink. I wrote in the log with my free hand, bad letters because the headlamp made everything jump. Do not whistle back. Do not answer. Do not let it pick your mouth. The pencil dug grooves in the paper. At the end, I pressed hard, and the lead snapped. The whistle came gentle on that crack, a pleased little rise like it had figured something out. The dark went long. The rain worked through the canopy and out of it in separate rhythms. At some point I slept sitting up, hands on my face, cloth tied tight. I woke to quiet. Not real quiet, but the kind where the noises are ordinary again. Rain had eased. The thrushes gave their first slow notes. I waited a long time before I went out. The boardwalk wore a thin film of bark slivers that hadn't been there at dusk. The big stump with the twin cuts had a new line in it, lower than the others, clean and exact, like a mouth learning to speak in a different place. The smell of cedar was so strong my eyes watered. In the sheen on the board by my boot, a tiny fish lay, silver as wire, gaping. There is no fish in a cedar bog, not like that. I nudged it with the toe of my boot and it slid into the water and was gone like it had never been. I packed. I left the shed neat. I locked the door because habit is strong, even when you know a lock is for people, not for whatever stands in a swamp and tries keys in wood. My friend asked why I hiked out a day early. I said weather. I said a headache. The look he gave me said he could smell cedar on me even in the open air. I kept the promise I made to myself and didn't whistle for a month. I avoided cedar when I could, which is not possible if you live here. There are cedar fences and cedar chests and cedar shims holding up old porches and cedar planters with geraniums in them. I learned to listen for the thin edge of the fourth note in the hum of a room. Some nights I wake to it right at my ear, patient, waiting to see if I will carry it. The closet in my apartment has a cedar lining, a nice touch the landlord bragged about. The first week I ignored it and kept my shirts there. The second week I hung everything else in the hall. Last week I woke with splinters at the corner of my mouth, 3 small pieces stained with my blood, cedar-scented. I hadn't whistled. I swear I hadn't. But when I stood in the bathroom and said my name out loud, my mouth made 4 notes first, as if it were rehearsing, and from the hall closet the door breathed in and out, slow and pleased, even though the window was shut and the night was still. You can laugh, but the bell I heard under Harrow Strait wasn't on any buoy. I've paddled those waters since I was a kid. I know each sound on the channel the way I know my own voice. A bell buoy carries a lazy clang, you know? It drifts with the wind and the tide. But this one moved like it had a mind of its own. It slid right under us. I used to guide sea kayaks out of Friday Harbor, taking folks to see the orcas and those pink sunsets that look like they are repainted onto the San Juan sky. It was a good gig. Mostly peaceful. One late summer evening, though, the fog rolled in early, thick and slow, just swallowing the horizon. I had 2 clients that night, a couple from Arizona who'd never seen a tide that pulls in 2 directions at once. They were having a great time at first, laughing at the kelp that tickled their paddles, at how the cold air made their breath look like little ghosts. But the laughter faded when the fog bell started. It came as this low note, 3 soft hits in a row, not clangs, not the sharp sound of metal on metal. It was like someone was striking a bell under a thick blanket, and the sound just pushed through the water, right into my bones. I felt it more than I heard it. My first thought was maybe it was one of the green buoys over toward Turnpoint, but we were way too far east for that. The current was in that strange, quiet moment between movements. The water had flattened out into this oily calm. There should have been the slap of swell against the shoreline rocks. There was only that bell, 3 times right under us. The woman in the front kayak turned to me, her voice a little shaky. "Is that normal?" I lied. I said, "Oh, it's probably just a bell on a crab pot." She believed me because, why wouldn't she? She didn't know that crab pots don't sing. My gut told me to get them out of the water. I set our course toward a little pocket cove I knew, tucked beneath a sandstone bluff. There's a short path from the beach up to an old lighthouse keeper's shed. I thought it would be safer to get the clients out of the fog, warm them up, maybe call one of our guys to come fetch them by skiff if the fog got any thicker. The bell rang again. 3 beats. This time, the man stiffened and turned his head, like a dog catching a scent on the wind. He said, "It feels like it's inside my ears." I dipped my paddle in, more out of habit than anything else, just to sound the water. The blade moved through something that felt like heavy silk. It was just wrong. Above us, the gulls went silent and started drifting farther toward the shore. The bell answered, and I swear I felt it push up through the shaft of my paddle. It had weight to it. A physical presence. I didn't say that out loud, of course. As we slid into the cove, the fog just gathered itself and dropped. The world shrank to a tiny circle of milk around us. My headlamp cut a little tunnel through it, but that was it. On the bluff, I could just make out the solitary shape of the old shed, a square, dark shadow peeking through the mist. The beach was a thin strip of pebbles. I could smell wet cedar and something else under it, something sharp and sour like old iron. We beached the kayaks and pulled them up above the tide line. The woman hugged herself and said, trying to make a joke of it, "We're not going to get kidnapped out here, right?" "No, of course not," I told her, forcing a smile. I didn't tell her how many boats I'd watched vanish into fog like this when I was a kid. How some came back days later with no one on board. I told myself not to pass my fear on to them. It wasn't their burden. Then the bell sounded again. Louder, even though we were on land now. It rolled up from the water in 3 slow strikes and then stopped. There are no buoys in that cove. There is nothing to make that noise. I told the couple to sit tight by the kayaks while I scouted the path up the bluff. I clicked on my phone light and started up the sandstone steps that were cut right into the cliff face. The light felt strange, pale and weak, like it had to travel through something thick just to reach my eyes. I glanced at my phone. The battery read 3%. 3%. I had charged it to full right before we left the shop. I stopped, trying to reason with myself. The cold must have drained it, but the air wasn't that cold. There's an alcove about halfway up carved into the bluff. It has an old rusted ring set into the stone where people used to tie up their rowboats. As my light passed over it, I saw it was slick with some dark growth that wasn't moss. The phone light skittered over the wall and found a second ring I had never, ever noticed before. It was set lower, almost at ankle height. The metal was pitted and green. The stone around it looked wet, as if something had been dragged through that alcove again and again and again. I heard the couple whispering below me, their voices small and lost in the fog. The bell sounded again, and the stone under my hand seemed to hum back in response. That was when I noticed the prints on the steps ahead of me. Bare feet, narrow, going all the way up from the beach, and there was a smear along the edge of each print, like someone had walked up with water just running off their skin. The prints looked fresh, but the steps themselves were bone dry. I could see fine dust and little pebbles inside the outlines. There were no other scuffs, no shoe marks, just those narrow, wet-looking feet on dry stone. I stood there on the landing, not breathing. The bell rang a 4th time. It made the air feel like a chest filling in slow motion. I turned my light back into the alcove, sweeping it across the back wall. The beam caught a shape I first thought was a coil of rope. It was not rope. It was a chain. Thick, corroded links caked with old salt and barnacles, as if it had just been pulled out of the deep sea and left there to harden. The chain ran from the lower ring into a shallow pit in the floor of the alcove. The pit was dry, and it was full of shells. Shells that were not from that cove. They were thinner, almost translucent, and rimmed with black. They were stacked like someone had poured them there by the handful. I crouched down, placing my ear to the stone floor of the alcove, listening for anything. And that was when I felt it. Not a sound. It was pressure, 3 small, distinct pulses against the bones of my ankle. I angled my light down and saw new wetness blooming around my shoe, seeping out from the stone. Then, from the dark lip of the pit, a cold hand closed around my ankle. It clamped my ankle so hard I felt my bones touch. The skin was slick and gritty, like the underside of a rock that never sees sun. Little hard things pressed into me. At first I thought pebbles, then I realized they were bits of shell set into the pads of the fingers like nails. They bit. I went down on one knee, my light pinwheeling, and the bell rolled up through the stone. 3 slow pulses that made my teeth ache. I yelled without meaning to. The couple below called up, their voices thin in the fog. "Are you okay?" the woman asked. My voice came out too fast. "Stay there, do not come up." I said it like a command. I dug my fingers into the rock to get leverage. The hand tugged, not hard, but steady, like it had all night. It wanted me inside that pit. The chain gave a lazy rasp, a barnacle on metal hiss, and the smell of old iron got sharp. I kicked at the wrist. It was narrow, small. The skin slid under my shoe like eelgrass, but the hand didn't let go. It climbed me instead, found the hollow above my ankle bone, and seated itself there like it had done it before. 3 more pulses rolled up from under the stone. The rhythm matched the squeeze, tight, tighter, tightest. I could hear the man below mutter, "It's doing it again." The woman said, in my jaw. Do you feel that? They were feeling the bell too. My paddle lay across the steps where I'd leaned it. I sucked in air and reached, my fingers brushing the shaft. The hand on my ankle squeezed again, so cold I thought I'd throw up. I grabbed the paddle and drove the tip into the pit. It slid into something that wasn't air. It was like pushing into a bag full of wet clothes. Then I hit something harder and the paddle bounced. The hand flinched. I felt the tiny shells scrape skin as it shifted. I hit again, angling the blade, not thinking about what I might be stabbing. Something under the stone hissed like water on hot metal, and the hand let go. I scrambled up, heart stuttering, ready for it to grab again. The beam of my phone cut over the pit and showed only black. The shells in there weren't still. They were slowly tilting, showing their thin, dark rims, like 100 tiny mouths opening and closing with the same sleepy rhythm. They made a dry ticking. 1, 2, 3. I stumbled away so fast I banged my shoulder on the wall. "Back to the boats," I yelled, voice cracking. "Now!" My throat tasted like a penny. The fog had settled thicker while I was on the steps. The world below was a blur with two moving shapes, and the faint white of our kayaks hauled up near the driftwood line. When my shoes hit the beach gravel, the bell hit again, deeper, slow, patient. It sounded closer. The couple were staring past me, not at me, eyes focused on the steps I'd just come down. "Did you see him?" the man said. He wasn't laughing anymore. His pupils swallowed most of the color in his eyes. "Who?" I asked, even though I didn't want the answer. "He went up behind you," the woman said, whispering like someone was standing over her. "Bare feet. I saw the water where he stepped, but there was nothing. There was nothing above it." I didn't look. I couldn't. I shoved a kayak down to the water and put the woman in. I clipped her spray skirt with shaky hands. The man was moving too slow, watching the steps, listening to something only he could hear. I put both palms on his shoulders and made him look at me. "We're leaving. Keep your boat nose to mine. If you feel anything under you, do not lean over. Do you understand?" He nodded once. A black line of blood was seeping from one nostril, fine as thread. I wiped it with my sleeve and didn't mention it. We slid out. The fog swallowed us without a splash. Sound dies weird in fog. Everything comes close. The bell did not sound distant now. It was under our hulls, inside the wood and plastic. 3 notes rolled up and my stomach clenched like I'd swallowed ice. Something tapped my hull from below. 1, 2, 3. Gentle, like knuckles under a table. We paddled for the mouth of the cove. My headlamp through a tunnel. Beyond it was just milk. Twice the woman gasped and stopped paddling, staring down between her knees like she could see through the boat. "It's cold," she whispered. "On my feet." I lied again. I told her it was the thermocline. I told her to keep moving. The current outside should have started by then. A pull around the point, but everything sat heavy. The world felt like it had paused to listen. We made the gap between the bluffs and the fog thinned for a second. Just long enough to show me something I wish I could tell myself I imagined. A shadow slid under us. Not big. No more than the length of a skiff. It had angles a fish shouldn't have. I saw the curve of a bell, old and battered, half buried in a tangle of something like hair. A length of chain drifted like seaweed, then snapped taut as if someone had picked it up. A white shape turned its face up to me. It wasn't a face, not really. It was as blank as the belly of a dead fish. But it knew me. The hand rose again, palm out, asking, requesting, patient. 3 fingers were whole. 2 were gone, clean, at the knuckle. I don't remember the neck strokes. I just remember the color of the water changing from that heavy black to a lighter gray, the dull outline of shoreline appearing, and the sound of the bell sinking a little far enough that I could pretend it was a real buoy again. We hugged the rocks all the way back to the marina. I sat the couple on the dock under a sodium light that buzzed and made moths dance. The woman shook so hard her teeth clicked. The man held his jaw like it hurt. When he finally spoke, he said, "My ears haven't popped." He meant the pressure. It would not leave. I never took clients back to that cove. I told the owner I'd lost a paddle there and left it at that. For a week, my ankle had a ring of tiny cuts where the shells had pressed. Every night when I lay down, I felt 3 slow squeezes, as if a hand were reminding me in the dark that it had found purchase and could find it again. The sound still shows up in places it shouldn't. It's in the pipes sometimes when I turn on the tap. It's in the walls when the heat clicks on. 3 soft notes, lazy and patient. Last month I was walking past the ferry landing at dawn. The foghorn was quiet. The channel was still. Something rang under the ramp. 3 times. When I looked down, the wet footprints came up from under the grating and stopped at my shoes. They didn't go anywhere. They just stood there like someone was waiting for me to move first. People think the last boat is empty and quiet. It isn't. It collects the ones who miss something and don't mind riding the dark for a while. I worked nights on the Bremerton run, deck crew, high-vis, gloves always damp. My job was simple. Keep people behind the line, throw the lines when we land, and catch the ones coming back when the dock hands toss them. I liked the rhythm of it all. I liked the hum of the big engines vibrating through the soles of my boots and the way the city lights would rise slow out of the black, turning the bay into a sea of broken glass. The night it happened was in January, a cold fog that tasted like pennies hanging in the air. The horn sounded, but the sound just fell a few feet and lay down, as if the fog itself had eaten it. We had maybe 8 cars on board, a dozen foot passengers scattered around. A woman in a red rain jacket was sleeping sitting up, her hands clenched tight around a brown paper bag. A man in work boots stared at the floor like it was telling him a secret. A kid played a game on a cracked phone with the sound off. The vending machines sang their little electronic songs to themselves, one note always just a little too high. We pushed off on time. The deck went soft under my feet as the lines came in. The hands on shore looked like pale moons in the fog. I coiled the lines, stowed them, and did the walk I always did. Rails, doors, stairs, checking the quiet places where someone might be crying and not want anyone to see. The snack bar was closed. It always smelled like old coffee when the doors were down. On the windows, the condensation drew long, slow tears. Halfway across, the wheelhouse called down on the intercom, a calm voice I trusted. "Stand by, reduced speed," he said. "Visibility is low." I stepped out onto the bow and let the wet air find the bare skin at my neck. The water ahead was just a wall of gray with a darker gray behind it. There were no buoys, no shore lights, no other boats, just the ferry's own lights floating with us, like we were carrying them in a basket. Then, the radio clicked. A voice I didn't know came through. It was thin and full of wind, like it was coming down a long pipe. "Inbound to Seattle, requesting slip," the voice said. It used our boat's name. It even used my captain's name. The wheelhouse answered, his voice firm but puzzled. "We are inbound," he said. "Say again." The thin voice replied, "Standing off. Passengers waiting." That voice sounded tired, so tired, like it had been talking for a long, long time without anyone really hearing it. I went back to the passenger deck. The kid had fallen asleep with his head against the window. His breath had fogged a shape on the glass that looked eerily like a handprint, but from the other side. The woman in the red jacket was awake now. She was watching the door to the bow like a dog watches a door right before someone knocks. "Do you ever skip a stop to save time?" she asked me, her voice low. I told her no. Ferries don't skip stops. We go where the slip is, or we don't go at all. The intercom clicked again. "Deck on the bow," the wheelhouse said. "Get eyes on the slip." I went back out. The cold went straight through my gloves this time, making my fingers feel like dry sticks. I raised my flashlight, but the beam only went 3 feet before turning back on itself. Then the gray thinned just enough and I saw a shape. A slip, yes, but not our slip. The aprons were made of wood instead of steel. The pilings wore old creosote jackets, fat and wrinkled from the water. The number on the pier face was wrong. It was painted in a hand I'd only seen in old photos back at the terminal. It looked like a mouth with a missing tooth. The captain rang for more speed and the engines obliged like they always do. But the water felt thick like we were pushing through syrup. We came at that slip slow, way too slow, and the fog peeled back just enough to show figures standing on the pier. I felt a wave of relief rise in my chest and almost waved. Then I saw the first one lift his hands to take our line, and I froze. He wore the same jacket as me. He had the same grease stain on the right sleeve. The same reflective tape with a burn on it from where I had leaned against a hot light weeks ago. He looked like me, but without the weight of breath, like a photo propped up behind glass. He didn't blink. He just held his hands out, palms up, waiting. Behind him, the dock had people lined up along the rail, quiet, patient, just watching. There was no chatter, no phones, no one coughed. They wore clothes that didn't know what decade it was. A boy wore a wool coat 3 sizes too big and had no shoes. A woman had a scarf wrapped so tight I couldn't see her mouth, but her eyes were wrong. Not empty. They were too focused, like she was watching the wrong ferry and waiting to see what would happen to theirs. I keyed my radio. "We've got hands on the pier," I said. "Recommend we—" I didn't finish. The radio spit my own voice back at me, half a second late, saying the exact same words in a smaller, tinnier tone. Then faintly under it came another me farther away, older, saying, "We never got in." The intercom went dead for a heartbeat. The deck under my boots shifted, like we'd just touched something that wasn't water. On the passenger deck, the door opened by itself and a little river ran in, just enough to wet the paint. Wet footprints appeared in a line from the door to the bow window, and then they went up the glass higher than any person could possibly step. The woman in red stood up, clutching that paper bag. "I'm not missing it again," she said to nobody, or maybe to the dark beyond the rail. We were 10 feet out. I could have thrown a line and hit my own chest on the pier. The figure with my jacket lifted his chin, a signal I had given 100 times before. I lifted the coil. My hands knew the weight. The engines leaned into the water, and the fog fell inward like a curtain parting. The slip opened its mouth wider. The shore tilted, all wrong. The captain rang for back, then ahead, then nothing at all. The wheelhouse door clicked open above me. I looked up and saw someone step out that should not have been there. He put both hands on the rail and leaned down like he was about to call my name. And in his face I saw a thing I recognize when I shave in the morning. He was me, but older, worn down by a kind of tired I couldn't comprehend, and he was mouthing 2 words to me: do, not, throw. I froze, the heavy rope a living thing in my hands. It was soaked, though no spray had reached it. Above me, my other self repeated the warning, his mouth forming the words like a failed prayer he'd said 1,000 times before. Do not throw. I took a single step back from the rail. The whole ferry seemed to sigh in relief, a soft groan from its steel bones. But the other figure, the one on the pier wearing my jacket, just stood there, palms up, waiting. The crowd behind him swayed together, a silent human tide. The fog shifted and I saw the slip numbers on the pier. The paint was running, the wood was black with fresh tar, not the familiar weathered gray. this wasn't our pier. A woman in a red coat brushed past me, her paper bag crackling. "I am not missing it again," she muttered, reaching for the bow door. It swung open before she touched it, releasing a smell like old wet metal. Wet footprints appeared on the floor, climbing the glass of the door like a ghost child on a ladder. I tried my radio. "This is Deckhand Miller, come in." All I got back was my own voice, a half-second delayed, an echo in the fog. "I called the wheelhouse," a voice answered. It sounded like my captain, but it was wrong, stretched and distorted. "Stand by to make fast," it rasped, the last word drawn out like a rope straining under a terrible weight. The coil in my hands twitched. A loop snaked over the rail on its own. I clamped down, a burning cold searing through my gloves. The rope pulled, not from the pier, but straight down, as if something monstrous in the deep had grabbed it. My other self, my older self on the ferry above, leaned out further, his face a mask of primal terror. He threw something. It clattered on the deck by my boot, my knife. I didn't think, I just acted. I slashed at the rope. The blade bit deep and black fluid like blood gushed from the cut. The severed ends writhed, trying to rejoin. I hacked at it again and kicked the free end away. The other piece snapped down into the fog and vanished. A collective breath seemed to leave the ship. The figures on the ghost pier were still, frozen. The one wearing my jacket slowly lowered his hands. The radio coughed. A tired voice, distant and submerged, whispered, "We never got in, we never get in." I looked up. The wheelhouse door was open. The rail where my double had stood was empty. The woman in red was stepping through the bow door, toward that wrong pier. I lunged, grabbing her arm. Her paper bag ripped, spilling its contents. Old ferry tickets, dozens of them, fluttered to the deck. The dates were all wrong. Some were from years ago. Some were for dates that hadn't happened yet. They pulsed faintly, like gills, with each groaning breath of the ferry. "They said one more," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the ghost pier. The passengers there all turned their heads at once, a slow, synchronized movement that twisted my gut. It wasn't hunger in their eyes. It was purpose. It was aim. Suddenly the engines died, but the ferry kept moving, gliding silently toward the mouth of that damned pier. The lights on the shore were soft and wrong, like trapped fireflies. I screamed into the radio, "Back full! Emergency!" My own words came back at me, thin and reedy, a cheap recording. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. The wheelhouse was empty. My coat was hanging on a hook, dripping wet even though I was wearing it. The ship's log was open. On the page, one line was written over and over in different inks. "Stand by for night. Stand by for night." The time at the top of the page never changed. I looked out the window and my heart stopped. Alongside us, another ferry, our ferry, was mirroring our course, its lights just as wrong. And on its deck stood another me. He had my jacket, my gloves, even the little scar on the left one. He saw me. He lifted his chin, a small, familiar gesture, and his mouth formed the words, "Do not throw." A line whipped out of the fog and cinched around my wrist, cold as a drowned man's hand. It tightened, pulling me to my knees. The whole ferry leaned with the force of it. I saw my reflection in the glass. Older, haunted, aged by a single night. I jammed the point of my knife under the rope and pried. It screamed like scraping ice. Fibers parted, revealing a dark, pulsing core, and then it snapped. I fell back, hitting the captain's chair. A pale ring like a brand was left on my skin. As the first hint of dawn broke, the fog thinned. The ghost pier with the wrong numbers receded, sinking back into the mist like a bad dream. Our engines roared back to life and we came into the real slip, clumsy and fast, but we made it. The dock hands I knew were there, their bright jackets a welcome sight, their curses about our rough landing the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I turned to the woman in red. She clutched her torn bag. A single ticket lay on the deck by her foot. The date on it was for next Friday. She just looked at me with the vacant expression of someone who has arrived for an appointment that will never be kept. I still work nights, I have to, but I keep the knife in my pocket now. Sometimes on the gray runs, the radio crackles with a call for a slip that shares our name, but the voice is one I never want to hear again. And some nights, when the fog is just right, I see it. A shadow off our starboard side, a ferry pacing us in the mist. On its bow, a figure who looks like me lifts his chin, and his mouth shapes the silent prayer, "Do not throw." And the rope in my hands always feels like it wants to leap, like it knows that one perfect throw is all it would take for us to finally come into that harbor, where the lights are always soft, and the night never ever ends. Here in Portland, people talk about the Shanghai tunnels like they talk about the rain. It's just part of the city's fabric. I used to be a skeptic. I'd just nod, pour another drink, and lock up the bar. I never went on the official tours. Why would I? I had my own keys. I was working the closing shift at this old spot off Ankeny. Classic Portland vibe. Brick bones, stained glass, the whole 9 yards. And it had a trap door right near the beer cooler. The owner just called it storage. He'd also point to the cold draft seeping from under it and call it free air conditioning. But this wasn't just a cold draft. It was heavy. It had a presence. It would push out, then pull back, with a slow, steady rhythm, like something breathing in its sleep. The bar back used to say the bottles themselves were breathing, noticing how the labels would crinkle on damp nights. He wasn't entirely wrong. The night I finally went down, the rain was coming down in that patient, persistent way only Portland rain can. The last customers left. I locked the front door, switched off the neon sign, and just stood there for a minute. The bar was silent, but it was a loud kind of quiet, the kind that rings in your ears. And through it all, I could hear that slow, rhythmic exhale from the trap door, almost like it knew I was finally paying attention. The owner had asked me to investigate a smell. Sweet and sour, he'd said. Customers were complaining, so I pulled back the old rug, found the iron hasp, and worked the old chewed-up key into the padlock. It popped open with a sound like a cough rattling through a handful of coins. I lifted the door. The ladder descended into a cool, brick-lined space. My headlamp beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating a thick cloud of dust. But it wasn't dry dust, it felt soft and damp as I breathed it in, like finely shredded old fabric. This room was once a storage vault. I could see the dark, clean circles on the concrete where barrels had sat for decades, leaving their permanent mark. Then I saw it. A door, cut right into a wall where there should have been solid brick. Someone had smashed their way through a century ago and hung a simple plank door. The wood was worn smooth and shiny in one spot, right where countless hands had pushed it open. The latch was a simple iron loop, but it was muffled by a leather strap. As I touched the strap, it felt wrong. It was darker than it should be, and it gave off a faint, sweet smell, like old-timey medicine. I moved the strap and pushed the door open. The corridor beyond sloped down like a throat. The air was tight, claustrophobic. I had to hunch my shoulders to avoid scraping both walls at once. And the floor, it wasn't a floor. It was hard-packed sand, raked into tiny ribs, like a net had been dragged across it. My light caught glints of things trapped in the sand. A brass button, a delicate lace eyelet from a boot, a cork stopper with teeth marks gouged into it, a penny, turned as green as a cabbage leaf. The sounds of the street above were muffled and distant, just disconnected threads of noise. I could hear footsteps, then nothing. A faint tapping of water, then silence. I told myself, okay, just 20 paces, then turn back. I started counting, but it felt like the air was counting with me. It would push against my face, pause, and then push again. 3 quick pulses, then one long, slow one. It felt like a tide moving through a solid hallway. The sweet smell was stronger now, but underneath it was something else. Iron, and a bitter note that made the edges of my tongue go numb. On the brick wall to my right, I saw scratches. Tiny, carefully etched letters. Names, I think. Some of them were filled with a white substance, like frozen breath caught in the grooves. I kept walking and came to a bricked-up archway. It was the shape of the old river doors I'd seen in historical photos of the tunnels. But this one had a small, square hole left in it, near the floor. And stuffed into the hole, tied with string, was a rag. The rag was damp. As my light hit it, that sweet smell washed over me again, exactly like how people describe opium when they're trying to convince you they've never tried it. And then I saw it move. The rag pulsed, in, out, in that same slow, unbothered rhythm. It didn't care that I was there. Fine, I said out loud, just to hear a human voice. My own voice sounded small and thin, and it didn't travel far before it died. Just then, a sliver of cold air slid around my ankle like a cat and then disappeared down into the sand. I flinched back, and my heel sank into a soft spot I hadn't seen. The sand had a depression, a mouth. I yanked my foot out, leaving my shoe behind. As I bent down to grab it, the entire tunnel seemed to inhale sharply. The pressure change made my ears pop. My headlamp flickered, the beam dimming at the edges. I could taste rust, stale beer, and something like sweet tea sipped from a metal coin. I instinctively put my hand out to steady myself against the wall. The brick wasn't cold. It wasn't cold like underground brick should be. It felt like skin. It had a temperature. When I held my breath, it felt like the wall held its breath with me. When I deliberately exhaled a second later, a puff of slightly colder, wetter air puffed back against my palm. I snatched my hand back like I'd been burned. From the square hole in the wall, a whisper escaped. It wasn't a word, just the sound of a spent breath that had been waiting a very, very long time. I pulled out my phone. 1 bar. I started to text my friend Manny, a guy who knows every creepy crawl space under this city. I typed, "Smell is worse here," and wall has a plug in it. But before I even hit send, I saw the 3 little dots, the typing bubbles, appear on my screen, as if someone on the other end was already replying, pulling the words right out of my thoughts. The bubbles pulsed for a moment, then vanished. My unsent text just sat there with a little clock icon next to it, frozen. I tried to rationalize, telling myself I was being stupid. I took a step closer to the rag in the wall. In the beam of my light, I could now see a faint stain on it, the print of a mouth, the color of old blood. A mouth with very thin lips. Around the square hole, the bricks were damp, blooming with moisture. The air wafting through it had a distinct taste. It tasted of lantern smoke and sugar water. It tasted like falling asleep with your head tipped back in a rocking boat. It tasted like breathing someone else's air. Then a voice spoke, from right behind me. "Don't." It was quiet, spoken in a tone you'd use with a curious child. "Don't borrow from there." It wasn't Manny. It was too close. I spun around, my light cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty. The air pushed again, once, hard, like a chest full of water desperately trying to become lungs. My headlamp flickered again, and in the strobe-like flashes, I saw the sandy ribs on the floor moving. The little furrows were opening and closing, all on their own, keeping that same patient count. 3 short, 1 long. I stood frozen, trying to control my own breathing, trying to make it feel like my own again. But the tunnel answered. With each breath I took, my chest lifted, but it felt like something else was lifting it. It fell, but not on its own. The rag in the wall ballooned outward, and the darkness behind it seemed impossibly deep. That's when I felt it. The air rose up from the floor like a hand, gentle but firm. It pressed my mouth open, and the tunnel took its first drink from me. It slid into me like a patient tide. The breath didn't yank at me. No, it settled over my mouth and just pushed. I felt my chest compress, like a bellows being squeezed shut. A cold, sweet sensation slipped under my tongue. The air, it had a taste, like hot sugar left too long on a spoon. I tried to step back, but my knees just gave way, went completely soft. My head was ringing with this distant, far-off clink of glass. I clamped my jaw shut. But the breath, it was patient. It just found my nose and pressed there instead, like a hand gently trying a doorknob. I pinched my nose shut with my fingers, like a kid about to jump into a swimming pool. The tunnel, or whatever this place was, it let me have that tiny victory for just a single beat. And then the push came from under my chin, forcing its way up through my throat, as if my own lungs had turned on me, deciding to help it along. I coughed, but it was a thin, weak sound. Across from me, a dirty rag stuffed into a square opening in the brick wall ballooned out slightly, like a lung breathing inside a wall. I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the brick behind me. The bricks weren't cold, they were warm, body warm. I could feel them breathing back at me through my shirt. The corridor exhaled, and in return it gave me something. I took a reflex mouthful. It was not any air I knew. It was crowded. It tasted of smoke and sleep, and there was this little thread of something rotten at the core, something that had been wrapped in flowers to hide the smell. My lips started to tingle. A numbness crept into my gums, like a sloppy dentist had missed their mark. Something moved in the sand on the floor. It wasn't a foot. It wasn't a rat. The fine ribs and patterns in the sand all smoothed over in one direction, all at once, the way a bed smooths when someone stands up from it. I swung my light around, and that's when I saw them. Marks on the far wall I'd missed before. Tall hash marks, scratched carefully, right at mouth height. Every 5th one had a small notch carved below it, like whoever made them had a rhythm. 3 short, 1 long. Farther down, someone had drawn a rectangle with a little mouth under it, and then smudged it with their thumb until the mouth looked open, gasping. A voice came down from somewhere above, muffled like someone talking through a stairwell. "Don't borrow," it said again, sounding so tired. It sounded like my friend Manny after a long night, but wrong, stretched out, flat. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up my hand with a cold, blue light. One new message. From Manny. It sat right above the clock. It said, "Do not let it get used to you." I looked at the timestamp. It was from 10 minutes, in the future. I said his name out loud. "Manny?" The corridor sent the sound back to me, but shorter, clipped, like it didn't need all the letters. The rag in the square opening tightened on itself. Just once, as if a mouth behind it had decided to purse its lips. I stepped closer, turning my head to the side to keep my mouth away from it. I jammed my shoe into the square opening, trying to plug it like a cork. But the breath just went around it, through the leather, through the little stitch holes. My shoe filled up like a lung. When I yanked it free, it was heavy, wet, and a dark trickle dripped from it. It wasn't water. It wasn't anything I want to name. Enough. The thought wasn't really a thought, more like a surrender, a letting go. I turned and just walked. The tunnel tried to keep pace with me, the way a tide tries to keep up with a boat. It pulled at my tongue. The sand on the floor opened under my left foot and then closed over my right, like a hand trying to decide which to grab. I kept my light aimed at my feet. The door leading back up to the bar looked so very far away, so small. When I finally reached the ladder, the rungs were slick with this film that smelled like old syrup and iron. I climbed slowly. The breath rose right with me, pushing at the soles of my feet. As I reached the trapdoor, my headlamp flickered. The darkness above was thick, as if the bar had filled up with old theater smoke while I was gone. Lifting myself through the trapdoor, the bar just felt wrong. The air upstairs was too light, too clean. My lungs expanded and just didn't meet anything. I felt the distinct shape of a long exhale that wasn't mine happening right under me, finishing without me, and then waiting. The bottles lining the back bar were wet. Little halos of condensation clung around their necks. I looked in the mirror, and I saw myself, and over my mouth a shadow, the size and shape of a hand that wasn't there. I slammed the trapdoor shut and shoved the heavy keg dolly on top of it. The big padlock lay open on the floor like a metal tongue. Outside, the neon sign hummed once, then went quiet, and I just sat on the floor and started counting, the way my mom taught me to do when I was a kid having a panic attack. In for 4, out for 6. But the tunnel under me answered with its own count. 3 in, 1 long out. When I tried to change my own breathing, a sharp pain like a stitch under my ribs made me stop. My chest had adopted a new rhythm, and it wasn't mine. Then Manny called. The ringtone sounded thin, like a wire vibrating through a wall. "Don't be cute," he said. "No hello. Tie off the loop." I looked at the trapdoor hasp. The leather quiet strap lay on the wood like a strip of skin. "What loop?" I asked. He said, "The one you made when you let it taste you. If it knows your mouth, it will come for you where you sleep." I said that was silly, just to hear myself lie. He told me to get a cloth, wet it with salt water, and tie it over the square opening downstairs. He said not to breathe on it, and not to think about it while I was doing it. "But you will think about it," he said, his voice so weary. "And it will think about you too. That's enough to make a life for it." I made a bucket of salt water, my hands shaking so badly. I opened the back door and the alley air was good and bad all at once. Rain hissed on the steel dumpsters and the city breathed its usual breath. Diesel and wet paper and the greasy smell of food from the restaurant next door. But under it all, from the sidewalk grates, little drafts of air came up like mice. 3 little pushes, 1 long. I went back down. The rag in the square pulsed when my light hit it. The loop of iron around it was covered in a grease that wasn't grease. I pressed the salt-soaked cloth into the opening, hard. The breath fought me for a second, and then the cloth sank in, took the shape of whatever was behind it and held. The tunnel let out a long, slow exhale, like a patient leaving a clinic. And for a moment, just a moment, my chest felt empty and mine again. In the sand near my boot, a print appeared. A bare foot, narrow with the toes pointed toward me. Then another appeared beside it, the same size but pointing away. I left. I locked up. At home, I stuffed a towel under my door without even really knowing why. I slept on my side with my hand pressed against my lips. I woke up at 3 in the morning with my mouth open. The taste of sugar water and old nails was in my throat. My closet door was breathing, in and out, slow and pleased, even though the window was shut tight. I coughed, and a penny clicked against my tooth and fell onto my tongue. It was green, like old cabbage. I spat it into my palm. On one side, someone had scratched a tiny little mouth. On the other side, a date. A date that hasn't happened yet. And when I held it up, I could feel a faint beat against my skin. 3 short, 1 long, like a room under the city, counting down for a breath of air I don't even remember giving away. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more tales from the strange and unsettling corners of the world, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps and ensures you won't miss what comes next. Stay safe out there.